Welcome to Books vs. Movies, the podcast where I set out to answer the age-old question, is the book really always better than the movie? I'm Yuvia, an actress and book lover based out of New York City, and today I will be discussing I Heard You Paint Houses, Frank the Irishman Sheeran and Closing the Case on Jimmy Hoffa by Charles Brandt, and its 2019 adaptation The Irishman, starring Joe Pesci, Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, and directed by Martin Scorsese. Okay, that was a lot of more words than I anticipated. Hi, everyone. We will see how this episode goes because I am talking about something that it is interesting, but it's not like... I don't know, this isn't something that necessarily I would have researched on my own. It was cool to learn about someone that I knew nothing about who had quite a bit of influence on unions and politics and all of that stuff. But it's interesting, but I don't know that. Well, let's just get into it instead of me trying to explain myself. So, I Heard You Paint Houses, Frank the Irishman Sheeran and Closing the Case on Jimmy Hoffa by Charles Brandt was first published in 2004. The first words that Jimmy Hoffa ever spoke to Frank the Irishman Sheeran were, "I heard you paint houses." This is a mafia code that means you kill someone. You're painting the house with someone's blood. This book came to be after 5 years of interviews with Frank the Irishman Sheeran and between Frank the Irishman Sheeran and Charles Brandt. And Frank Sheeran ended up confessing so many things, including Frank the Irishman Sheeran ended up confessing so many things to Charles Brandt about the work that he did for the mob. And that includes 25 different hits, including one on his very close friend, Jimmy Hoffa. So Frank Sheeran was a World War II Army veteran where he saw an astonishing 411 days of active combat duty in Italy while he was serving during World War II. And then once he returned home, he became a hustler and a hitman, and he worked for the legendary crime boss Russell Bufalino. He became such an important member of the mob that then U.S. Attorney Rudy Giuliani included him as one of only 2 non-Italians on a list of 26 top mob figures. When Bufalino ordered Sheeran to kill Hoffa, he knew that he had to do it or else he would be the one to get killed instead. I had never heard of Jimmy Hoffa. I'd never known about this part in American history, and I don't know how important it is to overall American history or if it's more important to certain regions of the U.S. I wonder if New York, Pennsylvania, Detroit, Michigan, the states that were more affected by this actually learned this in their history curriculum, because this isn't something that was taught to us in Texas. And yeah, I mean, it is an important piece of history, but how important is it to the U.S. history as a whole, if that makes sense? I'm not trying to knock down anything and say that every single event isn't important, but there are things that affect certain states more than affect the country as a whole. So the 2019 adaptation, The Irishman, stars Robert De Niro, Al Pacino, and Joe Pesci, and is directed by Martin Scorsese. And this film gives us a look at Frank Sheeran's life when he went from being a World War II veteran to a hitman for the Bufalino crime family, and then his alleged assassination of his close friend, Jimmy Hoffa. So there is not too much that I want to talk about between the film and the book itself. I'm not gonna lie, this was one that I struggled with. In terms of the film, I recognize why it's so critically acclaimed. It's well shot, it's well acted. Everything, the way the story is told, all the different elements from costumes to cinematography to lighting, all of that comes together to tell this very well shot film. So I can understand why it's critically acclaimed. But is this a film that interested me personally? Not necessarily. And it's also not a subject matter. Like, I don't like the mafia, the mob, all of that is interesting to me in theory. But to watch a 3-hour film, this is the longest film of Martin Scorsese's career at a little bit over 3 hours. It's just a lot. I am not a binge watcher when it comes to films, and just I tend to have a threshold of like 2 hours and 30 minutes before I need to tap out and take a break. So to just try to watch this, like 3 hours of this, it just wasn't very interesting to me. And I understand why this was 3 hours. They packed a lot in there. They packed the majority of the book into this film. They packed the majority of what happens in the book into this film. And the same thing with the book. There's a lot of information in there, and there's also just a lot of names, a lot of nicknames. So while the author did a good job of saying the names of the people along with their nicknames, it was still just, I don't know if that just added to like, wait, who is this person again? How are they tied into this? It was just a lot of people, a lot of names, a lot of, and like all of them were involved in the mafia or the mob somehow. And it was just a lot. It was just a lot to try to remember every single detail. But the events of the film, sure, some things were embellished a little bit. They always have to be for the film. But for the most part, everything, the events of the book were all in the film, and they were pretty, like, they weren't embellished too much to the point where I feel the need to talk about it. So there's not going to be too much for me to talk about in that sense. So the book actually gives us a lot more of Frank Sheeran's backstory. And this was a series of interviews done over 5 years. So Frank Sheeran gave a lot of information about his life from way before he even ever joined the mob or got involved in the mob somehow. So we get a much more detailed look into his life. He tells us about his childhood, a little bit of how he grew up, his adolescent years, his time in the war, including the fact that he did serve active duty for 411 days in Italy. And apparently that's unheard of. Like, no member of the military is ever on duty for 411 days, because that is just too much of a mental toll for anyone to take. But he did it. And yeah, so he had a lot of experience in the mob and everything. I mean, he had a lot of experience in terms of killing and not feeling things at that point. So yeah, so we get a lot more of that. The film pretty much just starts off right before he gets involved with the mob. So it starts off, the film starts off in the 1950s. So like I said, at this point, he's grown up, he's served in the war, everything. And he is serving as a delivery driver for a meat company. And then he starts selling meat off to the side. He starts hustling for extra money by selling meat off to the side to different members of the mob. So yeah, I mean, with 3 hours, they needed to cut something, and the backstory is what was cut, and they jumped straight to how Jimmy Hoffa, how Frank Sheeran got his start with the mob, and little by little earned the trust and earned his way up to a pretty powerful ranking within the mob. As mentioned, he was only one of 2 non-Italians that were recognized as top mob members. So that's where the film starts off. So yeah, we don't get a lot of, like, it's briefly mentioned, like very, very, very briefly, but not as detailed as we get in the book, which is fine. It's already 3 hours. You don't need this to be a 4-hour long movie. One of Sheeran's daughters, Peggy, once Frank Sheeran and Jimmy Hoffa did become friends, they became incredibly close. Like, Frank, the Irishman Sheeran, was one of a handful of people that Jimmy Hoffa trusted to the absolute. So that's how close of a friendship they had and close of a relationship they had. In the film, this is something that Frank Sheeran mentions in the book, but it's a little bit more in passing, which is that his daughter Peggy actually grew quite close to Jimmy Hoffa, and they had like a really close relationship to each other. Like, this wasn't like, she didn't see Hoffa as like, oh, that's just my dad's friend. Like, it was a definite, like, she grew very, very close to him. So think of like, and more of like a niece, close uncle kind of relationship. So that's developed a lot more in the film. And the reason it's so important to develop that in the film is because Frank, after Sheeran killed Hoffa, Peggy estranged herself from him. So we needed to see how close Peggy and Jimmy Hoffa were. So the moment that it's revealed that Hoffa disappeared, so this was an unsolved mystery for a very long time, and it's technically still unsolved from my understanding. Like, even though Frank Sheeran confessed to the crimes, he is still referred to as being the alleged killer as opposed to the killer. So yeah, this is technically still unsolved. Whatever happened to Jimmy Hoffa is still technically a mystery, even though Frank Sheeran confessed to all of this. But anyway, so yeah, in the film, it's very important that we see this relationship between the two of them. That way, when Jimmy Hoffa goes missing, there's a very nice moment in which Anna Paquin, she has no lines whatsoever, and she's in this one scene, but she was cast specifically because of how well she can communicate with just her eyes. So when the news says Jimmy Hoffa is missing, Anna Paquin looks at Robert De Niro, who is playing her father, Frank Sheeran, and she just looks at him, and you can tell that she knows that he was involved somehow. And then she leaves the room, and we hear the voiceover say that Peggy is still estranged to him from since that day because of his involvement with Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance and killing. So yeah, it is mentioned in passing, and since it is the actual Sheeran confessing all of this, like and knowing that she's estranged from him, I can see why this might be difficult for him to open up a little bit more. One line that Peggy did say to him that wasn't in the film is, so after Hoffa's disappearance, Peggy told Frank, "I don't want to be associated with someone like you," or something along those lines. And then she never spoke to him again. So as much as Anna Paquin communicated that sentiment beautifully, I do wish it had been kept in the film, just because it is such a powerful thing to say to a parent, and it's just so hurtful. Like, I'm sure that's like one of the worst things a parent can hear, and then just to never have a relationship with that child ever again. So I do wish that they had kept that, but yeah, they didn't include that. Dolores, who is another one of Frank Sheeran's daughters, claims, however, that at her father's funeral, once Frank Sheeran passed away, Peggy did show up to the funeral, and according to Dolores, Peggy told her that she never believed that Peggy never believed that her father actually ever had anything to do with Jimmy Hoffa's disappearance and killing. So Peggy estranged herself, supposedly for a completely different reason. The reason isn't stated, but Peggy did say that she never believed that her father did actually kill Hoffa or was involved in his disappearance. And so Dolores thinks that the final thing that Peggy ever said to her father was him interpreting, her saying, "I would never want to be associated with someone like you." He interpreted that because of his involvement with the disappearance, because how close of a friendship they had, how close of a relationship they had with each other. He just felt incredibly guilty for the rest of his life for killing his really good friend. Like, he just felt such incredible guilt for that when Peggy spoke that line to him. There might have been plenty of other reasons that Peggy had for estranging herself from her father, but because of his immense guilt, he took it to mean as, Peggy cut me out because I killed someone that mattered a lot to her. So again, this is something Dolores is claiming shaming. We don't really know, but it's possible that Peggy actually didn't estrange herself because of Frank's alleged. Should I be saying alleged? I don't know. Like, I know technically this is all alleged, but this is something he confessed to. You know what I mean? I don't know. Anyway, so yeah, I just found that to be really interesting. But even like, I'm not exact, since the Frank died with that belief, and that is the sentiment they were going for in the film, I wish that they had kept that moment just to have it hurt just even a little bit more than it already did. And then in the film, Frank Sheeran's confession. So we hear his entire confession, and this film is told through voiceover, or there are moments of voiceover where he's filling in some of the gaps. So in the film, they went the route of having Frank Sheeran confess to a priest while he's in the nursing home. But obviously in the book, it's Frank Sheeran confessing everything to Charles Brandt, this journalist. And I can see it's one of those things again that Charles Brandt mentions in the book, is that it's in human nature to want to confess. Confessing relieves a lot of just confessing something relieves a lot of negativity and negative feelings and things that are haunting us. Once we tell that to someone, we feel a lot lighter. We feel like we can sleep better, all of that. So while he is not a priest and he wasn't there to absolve Frank of his sins the way that a priest would be, he does feel that the reason Frank Sheeran was able to confess so easily was just that he'd been holding on to this information for so long that he just had to get it out. So I think it makes sense if that was his view of needing to confess everything. I think it makes sense to have the priest be the one listening to this confession in the film. But yeah, that was just like a little subtle difference that they made. Yeah, that's really all that I wanted to bring to this episode. Like I said, there isn't really much more that I feel like I could add. This was just, I wanted to watch the film. I put off on watching it for 5 years, or I guess more like 6 years, because it came out in 2019 and I technically watched it last year. So I put off 6 years on watching it because, like I said, it wasn't really something that interested me. But I do think it is important, especially as an actress myself, it is important to watch all kinds of films. So I do watch films that are really, really good to really, really bad to stuff that maybe doesn't interest me but is critically acclaimed, because you can still learn so much by the way the story is told. So again, I can see why this film was so critically acclaimed, but it's not something 3 hours just was way too long for me, and it wasn't necessarily a subject matter that interested me. The book I thought was more interesting, but it was just I don't know who half these people are, and I'm having a really hard time keeping track of who's who. I know the name Hoffa, the name Sheeran, and the name Bufalino, but everyone else, I'm just wait, who were you? How were you involved in this again? What? Okay, yeah. So yeah, it was just a lot to try to keep track of. And I will say, I know I saw in a lot of reviews for I Heard You Paint Houses that they were disappointed that the film was changed to The Irishman. And I gotta say, I agree. I understand in theory why The Irishman was changed to The Irishman, because that's who the film is about. And just people, if they might be I heard you paint houses. I don't want to watch that. What the heck does that mean? So, movie titles, titles in general are so important. But I feel like in this case, I Heard You Paint Houses, you can add on to it and still let readers know what the book is about with the second title, the subtitle. I'm blanking out on the word, but yeah, the second part of the title, which is Frank Sheeran and what is it? Frank the Irishman Sheeran and Closing the Case on Jimmy Hoffa. So we know, if we're I Heard You Paint Houses, what's that? If we read the the second title, will know like, oh, okay, I know what this is about. We can't just call the film I Heard You Paint Houses, because people will be like, what the hell does that even mean? And they're not gonna like stick around long enough to watch it. And when filmmakers want someone to watch their film, which is everyone's goal, you know, they gotta change the name. But I will say, I do agree that I Heard You Paint Houses is just such a cool name. And then once you know what that means, it's just like, ooh, yeah, that's really cool. That's a really cool name. Or a really cool title. But again, I understand why they needed to change it to The Irishman. It's just, yeah. But yeah, I heard like once they said it in the film and I realized what that meant, I was like, ooh, yeah. And then just, yeah. Anyway, I Heard You Paint Houses is really cool. That's all I want to say. So I agree with people, but I understand why it was made. But yeah, this was very, very, very critically acclaimed. It received so many nominations at the 92nd Annual Academy Awards, including Best Picture, Best Directing for Martin Scorsese, Best Actors in a supporting role, one for Al Pacino and one for Joe Pesci, who came out of his unofficial retirement to star in this. Best Adapted Screenplay, Best Production Design, Best Cinematography, Best Costumes, Best Film Editing, Best Visual Effects. So yeah, it received quite a few, and I don't think it didn't win any of them. It was nominated so many times and it didn't win anything. Some of them I can see why it didn't win. Like, I haven't seen 1917, but I've seen enough clips of it to know that I definitely agree that it deserved its win for best cinematography and best visual effects. Yeah, all the things it was nominated for, I can see why it was nominated for those things, but I don't necessarily agree with some of the winners, like best production design going to Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. I would have not chosen that one. I don't know that I would have chosen The Irishman over that one, but I would have chosen something else for sure. Not Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. Yeah, so I can see why it didn't win, but just overall, I'm looking at like the 92nd Academy Awards, and I'm just like, this is I don't know. This was not a good year. I mean, I know I'm gonna get so many, like, Parasite, loved it. Bong Joon-ho for Parasite, loved that he won. But just like looking at some of the other ones, I was like, oh yeah, that was the year of Joker. That was the year of Once Upon a Time in Hollywood. There's some good ones. Like, don't get me, that was the year of Toy Story 4. Hate Toy Story 4. Doesn't exist. Anyway, I know I'm getting off topic, but just like looking at this year, I don't know. I feel like most of these, some of these films, I'm just like, they were not, I don't know. I'm not going to get into a rant right now, but yeah, I think it definitely deserved, The Irishman definitely deserved the nominations that it got. I don't know that I think overall, just looking at who won, except for Once Upon a Time in Hollywood, I think I agree with who ended up beating it in most categories. Well, maybe not Little Women for best costume design. You, as I mentioned in my Little Women review, watch Mikara Trueworth's YouTube video about why Little Women did not deserve to win. It's absolutely hilarious, and she goes into it's just a really funny video. So maybe The Irishman could have won for best costume design. I mean, I would have given either Irishman or Jojo Rabbit between the ones that are here, personally. But Little Women honestly just fits more of the formula, the Oscar formula, if I'm being honest. We know there's a certain formula sometimes, and that's why it's so easy sometimes to predict who the winners are, and then sometimes it's not easy at all. It just comes out of left field, like when Green Book won. Anyway, I've ranted long enough. I've talked about so many things that have nothing to do with The Irishman. So let's get back on track. But you're getting to know more of my personality, my thoughts and opinions. So I rated the book 3 stars, and I rated the film 3 stars as well. But I did think that the book was, despite my confusion, it's not the book's fault. There was just so many names and so much information and so many things that I don't even know what they were talking about. And like this, I did find this book interesting, but did I learn anything new? No. And that's mainly because it was very hard to follow. But, I still did find it interesting. And overall, like I said, I can see why The Irishman was critically acclaimed. I do agree with its nominations for the things it was nominated for, but just as a film as a whole, I didn't find it just wasn't something that was for me. I'm not really interested in like gangster movies, mob movies. Some of them are good and some of them I do like, but overall, it's just not something that I'm interested in. But I really did appreciate all the technical aspects of the film, and I did appreciate, I thought it was interesting. I know that this was kind of a controversial thing, which was that they used the same actors. So Joe Pesci, Al Pacino, Robert De Niro to play them when they were younger up until they were old men. And so they used de-aging technology to make them look younger. And that was kind of a controversial thing because people said it looked really, really bad and really fake. I didn't think it looked that bad, honestly. I didn't think it looked terrible. I thought it worked pretty well. Maybe I don't know. It didn't bother me. I didn't feel like it was distracting. So yeah, It didn't bother me. So just wanted to throw that out there. But so yeah, and the film was a lot easier for me to follow, like who's who. Like it helped because I was like, even if I didn't remember the names, it's like visually I could see who they were. And a lot of the names that were mentioned they're like important to Frank Sheeran's story. Yes, because a lot of them were people that he worked with or was hired by or that he performed hits on. So they are important to include them in his story, and this is his confession, and if he felt like including them, he had every right to include them. But like some of them like would be mentioned and then they'd be dead or so the film was easier for me to follow in that regard because it was like, okay, visually I know who that actor is. I may not remember his name, but I know that they were talking earlier about a hit, or they were talking earlier about this, or, visually I could see who they were. So I did like that I could keep track of of the events of the film in that way. So I was able to keep track of the events of the film, but just overall, it just wasn't something that caught that's my cup of tea. It's just not a story necessarily that I was interested in, but I did want to check it out because it's so critically acclaimed and I felt it was important to do so. So the winner is the book. I just, even though it was hard for me to follow along with the book, I really liked the extensive backstory that Frank Sheeran gave us about his life. And there was, as I said, this book was first published in 2004. And then after Frank Sheeran's death, Charles Brandt added like an epilogue, and then in later editions he ended up adding a lot more like supplemental stuff, which is where I read about his Peggy's claim that she didn't believe her father actually killed Jimmy Hoffa. So this was all stuff that was revealed to him after the book was published by people close to Frank Sheeran, or it was stuff that he waited to reveal, like stuff that Frank Sheeran had confessed after, like off the record, just things like that he felt the need to keep to himself until after Frank Sheeran's death. So I did like looking at all these different things. So that is it for this episode of Books versus Movies. Tune in next time. If you like what you heard, please leave it a rating and a review and let me know what you thought of The Irishman if you've seen it. Do you wish that they had kept the name? I heard you paint houses. Let me know, and I will see you next time. Bye!